Today my guest is Scott Allen, sometimes known as K. Scott Allen, to distinguish him from the many other Scotts out in the world. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Scott, you're a consultant.
That's right.
You are a book author. You are a trainer for Pluralsight, among other things, and you are the co-host of one of my favorite podcasts.
Herding Code.
So you're great. And also because you're out there a lot, you're making yourself public. I happen to know that you know a lot about MVC. In fact, your new book is about MVC.
Yeah, I wrote a book with John Galloway, Phil Hack, and Brad Wilson of Microsoft on ASP.NET MVC3.
And MVC3 came out. Well, let's go through the history a little bit here. MVC was an out-of-band release. It came out 2 years ago, I think.
Roughly, yes.
And,
it's a little bit hazy to me too.
Yeah, it's hazy because it's going so fast.
It
and
does
then when
go fast.
Visual Studio 2010 came out, MVC2 was released with that.
That's right.
And we thought we were done, but no. MVC3 came out less than a year later, I think, if I remember correctly.
That's right.
But we have version 10 by the end of the year.
Hopefully, but hopefully not.
All right. It's coming very quickly.
Yeah, I don't think we'll see another version until next year, though.
Next year, okay. Let me ask you this first of all. Why the rush to these releases? This is not Microsoftish.
No, I think it's a good sign for Microsoft that they have a team that's willing to iterate pretty quickly and try to release products and try to get feedback from the community on what's working, what's not working, and add features and not wait for the big bang every 3 years or every 2 year release. It's nice.
Yeah, it is. It puts a little bit of pressure on the development community. We've got to pick these things up. We don't have that big bang, that big learning curve. But then we have a lot more frequent learning curves to get up to speed on.
Right.
It can be significant changes.
It'll cause heartache to some people sometimes because you might build on something that gets tweaked or changed a little bit in the next release. But there's certainly a community of people that want to take the CTPs and take the betas and start building things, and they're willing to risk some breakage here and there. And the people that are looking for stability, they can always wait for major releases.
Good point. You don't have to upgrade from 2 to 3, for example.
That's right.
So let's talk about that specific release here. It's been out a few months. You've had time to write a book about it. You've had time to write applications in it.
Yes.
What's the big stuff that came out with version 3 of ASP.NET MVC?
Probably the big feature that people will be aware of is the Razor View engine. So the first 2 versions of ASP.NET MVC use the ASPX View engine, the Web Forms View engine, which was your typical ASPX pages that we've had with Web Forms for a decade or more, which worked, but to a lot of people and me also, I always felt like repurposing ASPX files for MVC was uncomfortable. And there were other view engines available, some of them very good, like the Spark View engine that you could use with MVC1 or MVC2, that were a lot better at allowing you to intermingle C# code and HTML in a file.
Yep.
Because that's what we really are doing in views.
And Microsoft hired that guy, didn't they?
Microsoft hired Louis.
Desjardins,
Louis Desjardins. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly or not.
I think I've heard him pronounce it. He doesn't pronounce it.
He doesn't have the French thing. Yeah.
It's more Minnesotan, I think.
Minnesota. Okay. Yeah, they hired that guy, and a lot of people said, "Oh, maybe Spark will come out in a release with ASP.NET MVC," which didn't quite happen. But Razor is certainly a very capable view engine, and to me, it made this release of ASP.NET MVC feels very mature because it feels like all the pieces there have been optimized and have been written for the purpose of building MVC applications. It's not like you had to open up these ASPX files or configure this different view engine to get things working out of the box in a way that was pleasurable.
Be more specific. What is it about the Razor View engine that makes it better in your mind than
Sure.
Web Forms?
Razor's very smart when it comes to transitioning between code, like Visual Basic Code or C# code, and markup. So HTML or even XML would be pretty good for. And people have used, and by the way, the Razor View engine isn't tied to the MVC runtime. You can take the Razor engine and use it as a templating language to build text files or mail merge things to generate mass emails and things like that, run it from a console application. But in an MVC scenario, it's really nice because you can start some C# code by using the @ sign. And if you want to write a block of C# code, you can use the mustaches or the curly braces and declare variables and all that thing, all those types of things. But typically what you want to do in an MVC app is just write a little expression that is essentially a response.write. So I want to write out the employee's name. If I just say @model.name, that would put it into the output stream. It would automatically be HTML encoded, so you're a little bit safer from cross-site scripting attacks. And the Razor View Engine is smart enough to realize that @model.employee is C# code, so it'll switch into C# mode when it sees that. And immediately after that, you might have another div tag or a span tag or a paragraph or something. It's smart enough to say, oh, this is where C# code stops, and now I have to switch back into HTML mode. And for the most part, you don't have to think about it. You can just write your expressions, write your HTML. Razor's smart enough to figure out which is which and generate the proper code behind the scenes to work. And then there's occasional situations where you have to escape something, or you have to be a little more explicit to help Razor figure out where the transitions are. But for the most part, they don't happen very often, and once they do, it's easy to get it to work.
Okay, so you are being explicit when you say this is where my C# or VB code starts.
Mhm.
That @ is explicitly
@
saying I'm out of markup, I'm into C#, and I totally get that.
Mhm.
What I don't, which I have trouble getting my head around, is that it just sort of figures out when I'm back to markup.
Right.
It knows that, oh, this is not C#, this is less than div greater than. That's obviously some
Right.
kind of markup.
Yeah, if you think about writing a very rudimentary parser, you might say, okay, @, we'll treat this as C# code and, until we meet some less than symbol. You know, that's not going to work all the time,
Right.
but that would be the basis for something that you would build on to do this.
Right. Yeah, it's more clever than I am, I guess, as I start to think about, in my mind, what that parsing engine would look like. It
Right.
starts to get very complex. Because less than means something in C#, for example.
Exactly.
But you know what got my head around more is I started thinking about SQL editors.
Mhm.
So you go into like SQL Server Management Studio, it's the same thing. You could put carriage returns in there, and it knows that you're just continuing the last SQL statement.
Right.
And eventually it understands, oh, I've stopped one SQL expression, I'm beginning another one.
Mhm.
It just knows that. It figures it out from the context.
Right, it does.
And this is kind of like that, at least in my mind. I got my head around it. Maybe implemented a completely different way. But having seen that allowed me to sort of trust that.
Yeah, you can trust it, and the nice thing is when you're inside a Visual Studio, the tooling built around Razor is just IntelliSense.
Right.
But it gives you that subtle syntax highlighting and little hints like that to let you know that you're doing the right thing. So you can look at a page and see where the C# code is because it's going to be colored slightly differently than the HTML markup and so forth.
Yeah, and that markup IntelliSense is better in version 3 than in version 2. At least, I don't know if that's an actual feature, but that's something I've noticed.
Yeah, well, things like with the Web Forms View Engine, if you needed to have a C# expression that wrote something out into an HTML attribute, quite often Visual Studio would get confused when you do that.
I see.
But with Razor, if you wanted to, let's say, write out an image tag where the source was equal to some expression, some piece of data that you were getting from the model that was read out of a database or somewhere, then you could just say image source equals @model.image URL in double quotes, and it's smart enough to give you IntelliSense to do that.
Right. Just very rapid context switching.
Right.
Just within a few characters. All right. So Razor's a big one. And in fact, it's an obvious one.
It is.
View engine as a developer, it's hard to write web pages without actually writing views.
It is, and they built a number of nice features around Razor that work really well for ASP.NET MVC, like layout pages, which are analogous to master pages in web forms. So you need something for the application that lays out, here's the template that everything has to fit in because I want a navigation bar here and a copyright at the bottom and some sort of sidebar with ads or something like that. In web forms, you'd use master pages to do that. In MVC1 and MVC2, if you were using the web forms view engine, you'd still use master pages. But in Razor, we use layout templates.
Okay.
And there's little tricks you can do in ASP.NET MVC to assign layout templates for your views to use.
Okay. What else? What are other new features?
Something else they worked on a lot was unobtrusive JavaScript.
Unobtrusive? What do you mean?
Right.
What's
So,
that word mean? It's a big word.
Obtrusive JavaScript would be JavaScript when you do a view source on a particular page that was rendered by MVC, you would see JavaScript embedded inside of it. So I'll give you two examples. In MVC1 and MVC2, if you did something like client-side validation, or if you used one of the AJAX helpers that comes with MVC, like the ajax.action link or the ajax.begin form,
Okay.
which let you perform a synchronous activity instead of the regular action link, which you click on it, you navigate somewhere else.
Right.
The AJAX action link, you click on it, it can pull information down asynchronously and
Without reloading the page.
right, and graft it into the page.
Okay.
So if you did that in MVC1 or MVC2 and you did a view source on the page, you'd actually see JavaScript embedded in the page to support those features. So for client-side validation, you would see a whole bunch of metadata in JSON format embedded into the page that contained all the validation things that had to happen.
Okay. And that's no longer true if I build that same validation using MVC3.
Right, so in MVC3, what they did was, number one, they embraced jQuery a little bit more. So when you launch a new MVC3 project, you'll have jQuery provided in your layout view, so it's available everywhere by default. And when you get to an edit or a create scenario or some page that needs client-side validation, all they'll do is include the jQuery validation plugin. It's one more script that comes out of your script directory.
Okay.
That will be there when you do file new project. Include that additional script on the page, and then all of the validation rules and error messages, they're encoded into what we call data dash attributes on an element. So two things about that. First of all, there's no hunks of JavaScript in there anymore.
Okay. All the
So
JavaScript's been moved into
right.
this validation JS file.
Right. There's no blobs of JSON. There's no one-click equals something crazy with JavaScript anymore. But all of the validation rules, how to perform validation, that's taken care of by essentially the jQuery validation plugin. But what it still needs is how to validate certain things. So what is required? What is the valid range for a number that's supposed to be in this input box?
Okay, where's that data?
So all of that's in the data dash attributes that I mentioned before.
So those are part of the HTML elements themselves, the form elements? Or?
Right. You might see something like input type equals text, so it's a text box. Data dash val equals true, which means this needs validation.
Okay.
And then perhaps something like data dash required, and then the error message string to be associated with that input if the user doesn't type anything in.
Okay.
That's the data that feeds into the validation engine. So what happens is, first of all, these data dash attributes are actually part of the HTML5 specification
Okay.
that says if you need some sort of private application data, private application state, things that you're going to write script for, to parse and
That's where
interpret
they
and
belong.
understand.
They belong in those attributes.
They belong in those attributes.
Okay.
So it's completely with the HTML standard. The good news is, and so what the HTML standard says is, to browser vendors, when you see something that has that data dash prefix, ignore it.
Okay.
And the good news is, even older browsers,
They ignored it anyway.
They ignored it
recognize
anyway,
that
right. So
attribute, they just
if
disregard it.
IE6 or IE7 comes across data dash val equals true, it doesn't know what to do with it anyway, so it just ignores it.
Right.
And instead, what happens is Microsoft, in one of their scripts, adapter scripts, they have some jQuery code that looks for those data dash validation attributes, lifts the data out, and plugs it into the jQuery validation engine for you.
Okay. Very slick.
It's nifty, and it's extensible, so you can write your own client validation rules. You'd essentially be writing jQuery validation rules for the jQuery validation engine to call. And it all works very well, and a lot of people like this because they don't see all that messy JavaScript in there that had a tendency to bloat up the page a little bit.
Sure. What else? What are other new features?
Then there was a tooling update that came out after the release of MVC3.
Okay, let's get back to our timeline again. So, MVC2 came out with Visual Studio 2010.
Right.
Like 9 months or so later, MVC3 shipped. You had to download that and install it.
Right.
And it just sort of plugged into Visual Studio 2010. And then
Right.
something else came out a few months later, like 6 months later. This was a tooling update.
Yeah, it was right about the time of the Mix conference, if I remember.
And they didn't call it MVC version 3.1.
They didn't call it.
They called it a tooling update.
They
Why
called
is
it a
that?
tooling update, and now if you go to the download site for MVC3, you get MVC3 with this tooling update.
Okay.
So it's just all going to be there. And essentially what the team did is they spent a few weeks building in some new features for Visual Studio, and for the project settings and for the dialogues that appear. They didn't change anything about the MVC runtime. They didn't change anything about the view engines. None of the assemblies that'll be in the GAC for MVC have changed at all. Just the tooling experience that you have inside of Visual Studio.
Okay, so Visual Studio changes when I install this. The MVC DLLs don't change, and
Right.
the code that I generate, HTML that's generated and downloaded to the client doesn't change.
All exactly the same.
And that all is the same, so
That's all
it
the same.
really is just a change to the tooling.
It's a change to the tooling, so it's things like when you want to add a new view, there's always been a way to right-click a folder or right-click inside of an action and say Add View,
I love that.
right? And it brings up a little dialog
lazy.
box. Yeah, you tell it the name of the view, what type the model is, and it could
Stuff
generate
out your
stuff out your
CRUD
view.
stuff. And,
Right.
yeah.
There's always been that dialog box that'll generate a starter form for you. The idea being that it's not creating your application, it's just giving you a starting point to go in and edit.
Right. That's great when you're just starting out, you need to know where do my views belong and what do they need to look like.
That's right. Now what they did with the tooling update was a couple things. One is they expanded the abilities of some of those dialog boxes to the point where you can now go into your project and say, here's my model. This is the object that I want to be able to manipulate. Now, please go out and generate a controller for me that has all the CRUD operations on it, so index, create, edit, delete.
Okay.
Generate all that for me, and also generate all the views for me right away. Create, edit, delete, index.
Gotcha.
You know, those are all out there. And it's customizable in the sense that you can also download your own scaffolding tools to customize the way that would appear.
Scaffolding tools, define that.
Well, you can download through NuGet. Oh, we should talk about NuGet,
Do it.
perhaps also.
Let's back up right now.
Um,
Let's interject it right here. We'll
We'll
inject some
interject it
NuGet
right here. NuGet. So NuGet's a fantastic little package manager for .NET. Again, this is something that's not specific to ASP.NET MVC,
Right.
but the PM for NuGet was Phil Hack, who's also the PM for ASP.NET MVC. So they have a lot of synergy. And the idea is that quite often you're inside of a project, any kind of project, console application, Silverlight application, WPF application, MVC application, and you say, I would really like to have something to do some logging, to help me with some logging, for
Okay.
instance. Now I have to go out and find the open source project that I like, download the binaries or download the source and build it and add a reference and get everything configured correctly, add some things to web.config. The purpose of NuGet is to try to make that as easy as possible. So you can right-click on the references folder in your project and say add, now what's the text it has there now? They change it every so often. It is add package or configure package or add package reference.
Okay.
And what it will do is go out to, you can search the public NuGet repository where people now have registered hundreds, if not thousands, of NuGet packages that, as the name implies, they package up some of these things that we like to use. So for instance, logging, dependency injection tools like Structure Map, Ninject, Unity, they're all available as NuGet packages. Alternate view engines, jQuery plugins like jQuery templates, all sorts of things are available in NuGet. So when you right-click, say add package reference and say, I want to use Structure Map, it can pull down the latest binaries, add the reference to your project, make some configuration changes if need be, add some bootstrapping code to the application if need be, and it's all just there ready to go right away.
Yeah, I like that. I've done that with things like InHibernate, which is a kind of a pain
Right.
to download and install because InHibernate itself has dependencies on other libraries.
Right, some
And
things
to
from
get those in
Castle.
as well.
And so NuGet,
it's smart enough to do that.
NuGet understands the dependencies that something has.
Okay.
So when you want to pull down an Hibernate, it understands the Antler and the 2 or 3 things that have to come down with that.
Yeah. So now we've sidetracked a little bit. Let's get back on track here. So now we know what
Yeah,
NuGet
so
is.
something else you can add is different types of scaffolding support.
Okay.
So maybe you don't like the built-in views and controllers that get generated by the default tooling when that dialog box comes up. You can install some custom scaffolding and execute it from a PowerShell command window to say, okay, scaffold out a controller using this style of scaffolding where, and I'll give you an example. You could build scaffolding. The default scaffolding can work with the newest release of the Entity Framework, but you might want to use in Hibernate.
Okay.
You might want to use different design patterns, like a repository pattern or something like that. You might want to make sure your scaffolding builds controllers in a way that you can use them with a dependency injection
Okay,
framework.
so I did build templates for this, in order to, and then somehow get it into NuGet, is that right?
Right.
Okay.
I mean, the scaffolding, you can think of it as a template.
Okay.
You know, basically what
Well, let's define
what-
it. We've used that word scaffolding a bunch of times. Define that.
Yeah, so the idea behind scaffolding, this might have originated with Ruby on Rails. It's the idea of, here's some code that I know I want to work with, my model. What I want to do is scaffold up all that stuff around it to manipulate that model.
Okay.
To give me some views and some basic controller code that can manipulate that model. Just many times it's boilerplate code.
Okay.
You know, so I just want to scaffold that code out and generate the controller that can manipulate this model, and then I'll go in and make a few tweaks,
Okay.
perhaps.
So you're building some code, maybe some views, maybe some controllers, maybe some other code that will be used in this context. It's not completed code. Somebody's still going to have to go in there and change it to fit their own needs.
Probably.
Or they're most likely have to.
Yeah.
It might be complete, but in most cases, I think you'll have more complex
Right.
business rules.
It's basically, yeah, and it's basically code generation, is
Okay.
what it is.
Okay.
Code generation based on metadata about your model in those cases.
Okay. Anything else?
In MVC3, actually, let me think. Is there anything?
There's a lot of things. Anything worth talking about? We should include in this.
Well, I mean, there's little things. For instance, the dependency resolver in MVC3 addresses a criticism that a lot of people had about MVC1 and MVC2 in that there were different extensibility points that had different APIs and different ways to inject things into the runtime.
Okay.
MVC was always extensible, but what they did in MVC3 with the dependency resolver is essentially provide a central service locator that you can plug things into
Okay.
that the MVC runtime always consults. So if you want to plug in your own view engine, your own view locator, your own action filter provider, your own metadata provider, you can do all of that through this dependency resolver. Instead of in MVC2, there was an API to do that, but it was always different. You know, you had to approach it from different areas.
Okay. So more consistency in the APIs.
Yes.
All right. That's a lot of stuff then for MVC3. Let's leave it right there until MVC4 comes out. In the meantime, where can people find out more about K. Scott Allen?
Well, there's the Ode to Code website, and my blog's on there, or I'm on Twitter as Ode to Code. And other than that, I'm a bit of a recluse.
A recluse?
You have to drag
You're
me
probably
out
the most
to
famous
the
K. Scott Allen in the universe.
That was my goal, be the most famous K. Scott Allen in the universe.
Scott, thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Friends don't let friends use technology when they're drunk.